Welcome back to our series on Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Today, we're diving into some of the most important chapters of the book, chapters 7 through 11. If you've ever wondered where profit really comes from and why the workday feels endless, this episode will connect the dots. Marx believed that to understand capitalism, we need to understand how value is created. He called this the process of production. It's not just about making stuff, it's about the relationship between workers and the people who own the factories, businesses, and resources. At the heart of it all is something Marx called surplus value. This is the secret sauce of profit. In these chapters, Marx shows us how workers produce more value than they get paid for, and how capitalists use this to grow their wealth. It's not just about hard work, it's about how the system is set up to prioritize profit over people. We'll also look at the struggles over the workday, how long people are expected to work, and how this fight shaped the way we think about labor rights today. Whether you're new to these ideas or just looking for a refresher, stick around. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear understanding of how capitalism works behind the scenes and why Marx believed it couldn't last forever. To really understand how capitalism works, we need to start with the labor process. How humans create value by working. It sounds simple at first, but there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Imagine a carpenter building a chair. First, they take wood, something that already exists in nature, and transform it into something useful. That's what Marx calls a use value. The chair has value because someone can use it to sit. But for the capitalist, that's not enough. The real question for them is, how much value can this chair create? Here's the key idea. The value of anything is determined by the amount of labor that goes into making it. This includes both the raw materials, like the wood, and the time the carpenter spends shaping and assembling it. But here's the twist. The carpenter doesn't own the chair they just made. If they work for a company, the owner of the company, the capitalist, owns it. Why? Because they own the tools, the workshop, and the raw materials. In Marx's words, they own the means of production. The worker's role is to add value, but the product and the profit it generates belong to the capitalist. This is where the idea of exploitation comes in. The worker gets paid for their time, usually just enough to cover their basic needs, like food, rent, and clothing. Marx called this variable capital. But the worker produces more value than they get paid for. That extra value? That's called surplus value, and it's what the capitalist keeps as profit. Think of it this way. If a worker spends 8 hours making chairs, they might produce enough value in 4 hours to cover their wages. But they don't go home after 4 hours. They keep working. The next 4 hours are spent creating surplus value, extra value that doesn't go to them. This is how capitalists make money, and it's why owning the means of production is so important in this system. So what's happening here? The capitalist combines constant capital, things like machines and materials, with variable capital, or the wages they pay workers. Together these create a product. But the workers are the only ones adding new value to the raw materials. The machines don't do that. They just transfer their existing value to the product over time. That's why labor is the source of all new value in capitalism. This chapter is the foundation of Marx's argument about exploitation. Workers create the value, but the system is set up so that they only get a small piece of it. The rest is taken as profit by the capitalist. As we dive deeper into Das Kapital, you'll see how this process is scaled up and how it shapes everything from workdays to wages. But for now, keep this in mind. Labor isn't just about making things. It's about who controls what's being made and who gets to keep the value it creates. In chapters 8 and 9 of Das Kapital, Marx zooms in on how capitalists generate profit and just how central exploitation is to the system. To understand this, Marx breaks capital into two parts: constant capital and variable capital. Let's break that down. Constant capital includes the stuff that doesn't change its value during production. Things like machines, tools, buildings, and raw materials. Think of the sewing machines in a clothing factory or the steel used to make a car. These things are important, but they don't create any new value. They just transfer their existing value into the final product. For example, the steel in a car might cost $1,000, and that $1,000 is simply carried over into the car's price. Variable capital, on the other hand, is what the capitalist spends on wages. This is where things get interesting. Unlike machines or raw materials, workers don't just transfer value, they create new value by adding their labor to the product. But here's the catch. The worker creates more value than they're paid for. That extra value is called surplus value, and it's the key to how profit works in capitalism. Let's say a worker gets paid $20 for a day's work, but in that day, they produce $100 worth of goods. The difference, 80, is the surplus value. That $80 doesn't go to the worker, it goes straight into the capitalist's pocket as profit. This is why Marx calls wage labor exploitative. The worker is creating all the new value, but the capitalist is taking most of it. So how do capitalists increase their surplus value? Marx identifies two main ways: absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is all about lengthening the workday. If a worker needs 4 hours to produce enough value to cover their wages, any additional hours go towards surplus value. By forcing workers to work 10, 12, or even 16 hours a day, capitalists can extract more surplus value. Historically, this led to intense struggles between workers and capitalists over the length of the working day. But capitalists can only make the workday so long before people start collapsing or revolting. That's where relative surplus value comes in. Instead of making people work longer, capitalists focus on making workers more productive. They do this by introducing better technology or reorganizing production to save time. Think assembly lines or advanced machinery. These changes reduce the amount of time it takes for workers to produce enough value to cover their wages, which means more of the workday can go towards surplus value. Let's go back to the $20 wage example. If new machinery allows the worker to produce $20 worth of value in just 2 hours instead of 4, then the other 6 hours of the workday go towards surplus value. It's a win for the capitalist, but for the worker, not so much. What ties all of this together is exploitation. Whether it's by extending the workday or improving productivity, the goal is always the same: to squeeze as much surplus value out of workers as possible. This surplus value is the lifeblood of capitalism. It's where profits come from. Without it, the system falls apart. Marx's analysis doesn't just apply to factories in his time. It's still relevant today. Think about delivery drivers or freelance workers. They create value, but they only get a fraction of it, while the companies they work for pocket the rest. The tools might look different, but the exploitation is the same. So, what do chapters 8 and 9 teach us? They show that capitalism isn't just about making products. It's about who controls the value created by workers. By dividing capital into constant and variable parts, and by focusing on surplus value, Marx reveals the mechanics of exploitation that are still shaping our world today. In Chapter 10, Marx dives into one of the most intense battlegrounds of capitalism, the length of the working day. It's about more than just hours on the clock. It's a story of struggle between the relentless drive for profit and the basic human need for rest, health, and dignity. For capitalists, the workday isn't just about getting things done. It's about maximizing surplus value. Remember, surplus value is the extra value workers create after producing enough to cover their wages. The longer the workday, the more surplus value is squeezed out of workers. But for workers, every extra hour on the job comes at a cost: exhaustion, injury, and time stolen from their families and lives outside of work. This conflict between the capitalist's hunger for profit and the workers' need for rest is at the heart of the fight over the working day. In the early days of capitalism, there were no rules. Workdays stretched to 12, 14, or even 16 hours. Entire families, including children, were sent into factories to work under dangerous conditions. Why? Because capitalists wanted to extract as much surplus value as possible, regardless of the human cost. But workers didn't accept this quietly. Over time, they organized, protested, and demanded limits on how long they could be forced to work. This led to fierce battles, both in the streets and in governments. Marx calls this the struggle for the normal working day. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about survival. Of course, capitalists fought back. They argued that shorter workdays would ruin the economy and make businesses uncompetitive. Some even claimed it was natural for workers to toil endlessly. Marx highlights this hypocrisy, showing how capitalists ignored the suffering of workers to protect their profits. Despite their resistance, workers began to win victories. Laws like the Factory Acts in England introduced limits on working hours, especially for women and children. These laws were far from perfect, but they marked a turning point in the struggle between labor and capital. Even though Marx wrote about factories in the 19th century, his analysis still applies today. While we now have an 8-hour workday in many places, the fight isn't over. Think about gig workers and delivery drivers, who often work long hours without benefits, or salaried employees who feel pressure to stay late and answer emails after hours. The tools may have changed, but the push for longer hours hasn't gone away. Marx ends the chapter by reminding us that the fight over the workday is about more than just hours. It's about power, who gets to control your time. The capitalist sees time as a tool to make profit, while workers see it as a part of life that belongs to them. In a capitalist system, time is money, but for workers, time is life. That's why the struggle over the working day has always been one of the most important fights in the history of labor. So, what can we take away from Chapter 10? First, that the push for longer hours isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature of capitalism. Second, that every gain workers make, like shorter hours or better working conditions, comes from struggle. Capitalists don't hand over these victories, they're fought for. In Chapter 11 of Das Kapital, Marx shifts gears to show us the bigger picture. It's not just about the individual worker or factory, it's about scaling the system to maximize profits. This chapter dives into two key ideas: the rate of surplus value and the mass of surplus value. Together, these explain how capitalists expand their wealth by exploiting labor on a massive scale. First, let's talk about the rate of surplus value, which measures how much surplus labor a worker provides compared to the labor needed to cover their wages. Marx expressed it as a simple formula. The rate of surplus value equals the surplus labor time divided by necessary labor time multiplied by 100. Imagine a worker spends 4 hours earning enough value to cover their wages. Marx calls this necessary labor time. But if they work an 8-hour day, the remaining 4 hours are surplus labor time, which creates surplus value for the capitalist. In this case, the rate of surplus value would be 100 cents. The capitalist gets as much value as they pay out in wages. The higher the rate of surplus value, the more profitable the worker becomes for the capitalist. And this is why extending work hours or increasing productivity without raising wages is so important in capitalism. But what if a capitalist wants even more profit? This is where the concept of the mass of surplus value comes in. The mass refers to the total amount of surplus value produced across all workers in an operation. Here's the math. The mass of surplus value equals the rate of surplus value multiplied by the number of workers multiplied by the length of the workday. For example, if a factory has 10 workers each producing $50 in surplus value per day, the total mass of surplus value is $500. But if the capitalist hires 100 workers, the mass jumps to $5,000, even if the rate of surplus value stays the same. This is why capitalists are obsessed with scaling up. By hiring more workers, extending the workday, or introducing technology to increase productivity, they can extract more surplus value. It's not just about squeezing more out of individual workers, it's about expanding the operation as a whole. However, there's a limit. Hiring more workers or buying more machinery requires more capital. Marx points out that the balance between constant capital, machines and materials, and variable capital, wages, is key. Capitalists are always looking for ways to maximize the ratio of surplus value to their overall investment. So why does this matter? because it shows us how capitalism depends on constantly expanding and intensifying exploitation. As competition drives capitalists to grow, they look for new ways to extract surplus value, whether by cutting wages, making workers more productive, or outsourcing labor to cheaper markets. This creates a cycle of growth that benefits the capitalist but leaves workers overworked, underpaid, and struggling to keep up. Marx also highlights a contradiction here. Capitalists rely on workers to create surplus value, but as they invest more in machinery and less in labor, they undermine their own ability to generate profit. This is one of the key tensions in capitalism that Marx believes will eventually lead to its collapse. Chapter 11 shows us the mechanics of capitalism on a larger scale. The rate of surplus value reveals how individual workers are exploited, while the massive surplus value explains how capitalists scale that exploitation to create enormous profits. But this system isn't stable. It's driven by contradictions that create inequality and conflict, not just between workers and capitalists, but within the system itself. Today, we've explored some of the key mechanics of capitalism: how workers create value, how surplus value is extracted, and how capitalists scale this system to maximize profits. These concepts are as relevant today as they were in Marx's time, but the stakes have changed. Think about the gig economy: delivery drivers, rideshare workers, freelance creators. Many of them don't even have the protections of a traditional job, like minimum wage or benefits. They're paid for the task, not the time, but they're still creating value that companies extract for profit. The same system of exploitation Marx described is just wearing a new mask. And now we're on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution, a world where AI, automation, and robotics are set to transform everything. Machines and algorithms are increasingly able to perform tasks that once required human labor, from factory work to customer service and even creative industries. But this raises some big questions. If machines replace workers, who will create the surplus value that drives profits? Can capitalism survive a future where fewer and fewer human workers are needed to produce the goods and services we consume? In the next video, we'll dive into chapters 12 and 13 of Das Kapital, where Marx explores how cooperation, the division of labor, and machinery have shaped capitalism. These ideas help explain not just the rise of the factory system in the 19th century, but also how new technologies are reshaping the economy today. As AI and automation create a hyper-productive economy, will they also spark a new showdown between labor and capital? Think about it. If machines can work 24/7, what happens to the fight over the length of the workday? Will this new wave of technology lead to shorter hours for everyone, or will it drive more inequality as the wealth created by machines stays in the hands of a few? Marx's analysis of cooperation and machinery shows us how technological change has always been a double-edged sword, creating incredible productivity while also deepening exploitation. But it also shows us something else. Every advance in technology has been met by workers demanding a fair share of the wealth they create. The fourth industrial revolution could transform the world in ways we can't yet imagine. Will it finally free us from grueling labor, or will it create new forms of exploitation? Join us next time as we explore these questions and dig deeper into Marx's insights about technology, cooperation, and the division of labor. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments. How do you think automation and AI will shape the future of work?